We can see the pattern of devolution typical of the descending arc of the yugas in the changing use of the Vedas through time. We can surmise that as Treta Yuga man's mental powers began to wane, so would the effectiveness of the mantras. We can clearly see this pattern in the composition of the three Vedas that followed the Rig Veda in time, the Sama, Yajur and Atharva. While there is no debate that the Sama Veda was composed after the Rig Veda, there is no reliable means of dating the Sama Veda relative to the Rig Veda. The Sama Veda contains almost exactly the same content. In fact, the Sama Veda contains only 78 unique mantras beyond the approximately 1,000 mantras they share. The difference between the two Vedas is that the verses of the Sama Veda have been slightly altered to make them easier to chant. It is possible that the initial use of the Rig Veda mantras was entirely mental, to be visualized rather than spoken. Perhaps, as the descending arc of the yugas made a purely mental use of the Rig Veda mantras less effective, the remaining enlightened rishis, to compensate, added sound vibration. By tradition, Sanskrit is said to be based on nama rupa or name form. The concept arises from the belief that all creation is vibrating at subtly different frequencies, the consequence of having sprung from the primordial sound Aum, Pranava, or the Word, as it is expressed in the Christian Bible. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The ancient rishis are believed to have heard the vocabulary of Sanskrit, each word corresponding to the way an object or concept actually sounds as it vibrates in the ether. Thus arose the concomitant belief that chanting the words of the mantras would energize them, making them more potent and effective. The Yajur Veda, which was composed after the Sama Veda, also contains mostly Rig Veda mantras, but has a greater number of unique mantras than the Sama Veda. However, what primarily sets the Yajur Veda apart from the Rig and Sama Veda is that the order and presentation of the mantras has been reorganized as a guide for ritual. Yajur Veda groups the mantras according to the specific deities addressed, one group focused on Indra, another on Agni, and so on. The Yajur Veda appears to represent a change in emphasis from the personal use of mantra for intuitive attunement to priestly use on the behalf of others. The words of the mantras also appear to be treated more literally. The word yajna, for example, is translatable as sacrifice and appears throughout the Rig Veda. In the opening centuries of Treta Yuga, a sacrifice to Agni, now understood to be the god of fire, may have been understood as a way to personally attune oneself to spirit by accessing the fire of one's own energy. However, by the time of the Yajur Veda, Yajna was practiced as a physical sacrifice also, by offering symbolic objects into an actual fire. By the time of the composition of the Yajur Veda, many of the Brahmanas and Aranyakas, detailed descriptions of how to conduct Vedic rituals had also been composed, and a priestly class had come into being in order to perform the elaborate, often days-long rituals. The coming of ritual and a priestly class does not necessarily mean that the Vedic mantras were no longer effective. Even in the waning years of Treta Yuga, mankind still possessed significant mental power and, relative to the consciousness of our time, heightened awareness. But the lessened mental power of later Treta Yuga man could have required more ceremony, more methodical and deliberate focus for him to use the mantras effectively. The Atharva Veda may well have been composed in Dwapara Yuga. It has a distinctly different feel from the first three Vedas. There have long been differing opinions in India whether it should even be considered one of the Vedas. The verses and mantras of the Atharva Veda have a more obvious intent to manifest outward and self-interested results, from growing hair to getting pregnant to remaining sexually potent to destroying a rival. The Atharva Veda is often thought to be a book of magic spells and incantations rather than a high-minded scripture, although much of the content is clearly spiritual in intent. As you can see, Even within the Vedas themselves, the descending arc pattern of devolution is clearly evident. The Rig Veda, even today, is considered to express the highest consciousness of all the Vedas, while the Atharva Veda is often not considered to be in the same league, so to speak, as the other Vedas. We see an increasingly literal approach from the symbolic and impersonal presented by the Rig Veda to the physical and ceremonial presented by the Yajur Veda. And finally, we see the impersonal sublimity of the Rig Veda decline to a more personal and self-interested approach in the Atharva Veda.